Hello and welcome to the guide for Ral, heir to the Bone Throne, next in line to the meat seat, I don't know, maybe not descendant, inheritant of the Skin Bin. Thank you for joining me. I think a good place to start with this deck, first of all, thank you to Grim for commissioning this deck for me, and I think a good place to start with this deck would be its strengths. This deck fucks. Gives your opponents a one-way ticket on the pain train to Pound Town. Weaknesses? You are mortal. Fumbling the bag won't just hurt, it will kill. I am, at the end of the day, hard-pressed to think of a less hospitable location than at the table on the board when this deck is cooking. So let's get into it. Let's talk about what makes this deck scary, what are its weaknesses, what are its strengths, cards you should look out for when playing it, or frankly, playing against it. Okay, so a good place to start, I think, in this case, strengths. This deck can easily threaten a win before turn 5, if you have the right hand. In the guide that I had sent you, I had talked about how it is not unreasonable to attempt to threaten a win from turn 3 moving forward, but that's if we're playing pedal to the metal as fast as possible. There's nothing wrong with making sure that you have enough mana to go off before going off. And whether that's through trying to filter into your your 30 lands, which notably, pretty low land count for a casual deck. Most CEDH lists for this commander have like 27, 26 lands, kind of the standard for CEDH. With this being a casual deck, I wanted you to have, a greater chance of not missing your second land drop. That's just an awful spot to be in. So, yes, there's a lot of ways to filter in this deck. We have all these looting effects. Pretty much every looting effect that is 2 or less mana is in this deck. Some notable cards to point out, though, the kind of like bombshells when they hit the table. As I've alluded to before, Jeska's Will, Mana Geyser, Inspired Tinkering. These are all kind of like kicking it into the next gear. Like when you cast one of these spells, you're not just, adding a storm count on for your commander, You're also setting up for future spells. You're giving yourself gas for future spells. And really, that's what the deck just wants to do. Like you want to cast spells, you want to generate mana, and then you want to find a payoff. But the best part, perhaps, about this deck is that the commander is the payoff. That he can just, when he flips, giving you access to the top 8 of your library is really deep. Like, nope, none of those cards. One of these. Never mind. I thought spoilers. Don't look at those. Okay, so looking at the top 8 of your library is such a deep, dive into the top, right? Like that's very strong. And really, the only limiting factor is that you could hit artifacts, you could hit lands, you could hit creatures, and there's like 3 enchantments in this deck, so yes, technically, you could hit all of these permanents, but 45 of the cards in this deck, almost half, are cards that you can hit when you ult him. And this is all kind of obvious stuff. Moving on to what I anticipate the biggest problems are going to be. Yes, this deck has a lot of ways to filter and to find more filtering and more mana production. But this deck, any Izzet Spellslinger deck really, but this deck especially runs the risk of not drawing gas. You're building up that storm count. You're looking to go off. Check your pockets. Whole lot of nothing. Perhaps the hardest part of making this deck wasn't actually deciding which instants and sorceries to include. It was deciding which non-instants and sorceries to include. At first, I treated it like pretty much any other Izzet Spellslinger deck, and I had Archmage Emeritus in, but it just didn't feel necessary. And part of what makes Archmage Emeritus so good, yes, it's great to draw whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, but even better is every time you copy an instant or sorcery spell, it is way easier to create a ton of copies of a spell than it is to cast 40 spells. You have stuff like Reiterate, which is in and of itself a spell, but it copies spells. You have Thousand Year Storm. I mean, Mizzix's Mastery comes close. Mizzix's Mastery is good. It's really good in the deck, and it's a good enough card that perhaps it would have warranted running Archmage Emeritus, because every time, you copy a spell, you're just drawing a shit ton. But, see, this deck, one of the fears I have for this deck is that it's kind of easy to deck yourself if you're not careful. We have a couple safety valves, things that will hopefully get you into a position where that's not really a concern. Stuff like Time Twister, stuff like Echoes of Eons. These cards, these cards that shuffle your deck back into your library, so you can kind of just keep the chain going. But in an ideal world, that won't be necessary. But if we did put Archmage Emeritus in here, and it does what it is designed to do, sure, it's great to draw cards, but frankly, I'd rather just have another instant or sorcery that draws me cards. Case of the Ransacked Lab, it does a similar thing, where it draws you a card each time you cast an instant or sorcery spell, but it also kind of doubles up. I mean, it just does. It doubles up on your commander's cost reduction. Another card that provides a further cost reduction, Artist Talent, giving you that loot effect similar to Ashling, helps you a ton with that additional filtering to find your win condition. In this case, it's Aria of Flame, or the name of the deck, its namesake, the Sphinx-bone wand, passed down through the family for generations, delivering this boning free of charge. Jokes aside, Ashling, Flame Dancer and Artist Talent, Dragon's Rage Channeler, I always fuck up that name. These cards are just bangers in the deck, because they just add an extra line of text on your instants and sorcery spells. In Dragon Rage Channeler's case, it's just non-creature, so it counts 90% of your deck. Maybe not 90%. I didn't do math. There's 30 lands. The vast majority. It counts the vast majority. But the reason it's so good is it adds an extra line of text just saying loot or surveil when you cast an instant or sorcery spell. And being able to look at, let's look at like Ponder, for example, where you look at the top 3, then you draw a card. That's great in and of itself. But being able to discard your worst card in your hand, probably a land, when you're trying to storm off, if you have Ashling out, or if you have Artist Talent, is so valuable. Like, these are the cards that, if you're wondering what cards you should be looking for besides those instants and sorceries, besides your mana rocks, it's these cards. It's Ashling, it's Artist Talent, and to a lesser extent, Case of the Ransacked Lab. It's a great card. It's 3 mana. It's probably the closest to being cut in the deck. It is very good, and it doesn't have that, risk of overloading a Mizzix's Mastery and then just, losing the game. But with that out of the way, a couple other, just touching on each of these creatures real quick. Bergie, I think we all have a story where Bergie was on the field and your opponent is chaining together spells, and before you know it, they've taken a 15-minute turn, they've taken a 30-minute turn. It feels like this game's never going to end, and they're just getting a billion game actions. Bergie, its legend speaks for itself. Its name that it's earned. And of course, that's because creatures you control can boast twice during each of your turns. I didn't even know this text existed until our friend Ben reminded me recently. Anyways, Bergie out of the way. Urabrask is just kind of a slightly more expensive Bergie. I'm just going to go ahead and open it real quick so we can get a better look. Yeah, so, I mean, it's nice that we do have a way to ping our opponents that's not on our win condition. But really, the reason we have it is for this line of text, where whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you add a red. The amount of, like, 2-cost instant and sorcery spells in this deck is pretty high. 15, or even 3-cost, there's a good amount of red spells being cast in this, like, mana range. But, like, where this probably shines best is going to be your 1-cost spells. Your free Gataxian Probe, now generating a red, allowing you to cast your Rite of Flame, just by casting a Gataxian Probe. You now have the mana to cast your Rite of Flame, which generates another red mana, one of which you could use to cast Strike It Rich. Like, it chains into itself so well when you have one of these effects out. So, it may go without saying that these Bergie type of effects are very good. But the backside of Urabrask, I think I actually pulled it up over here. Yes. Is also really good in this deck. We don't have a ton of ways to proliferate because as one of the final cuts, I removed Flux Channeler. My reasoning being that, like, yes, it's really good when you have Urabrask out. It's really good when you have Ral out, or your win conditions, right? Like Aria Flame, Sphinx's Bone Throne, Meat Seat, Skin Bin. It's great when you have those cards out. But pretty much every other time that you have it out, it is effectively a 3-mana do-nothing spell. And that's assuming you don't exile it off the top of your library when you alt your commander. Its cost doesn't get reduced, so you're just paying the full 3 mana. And that's not bad. Like, we have another spell in this deck, Izzet Gauntlet, that costs 3 mana, does a similar thing, just kind of pseudo-proliferates. But the difference between these cards... Oh, let me see if I can play a game of Operation real quick, there we go. The difference in these cards lies in this line of text. That your commander now has the ability to grant you extra turns. Having this out and then flipping your commander is genuinely threatening a win if you're able to chain enough spells together. Because if you are able to get it up to your commander up to 12 counters, let's say 13 counters, and we have Time Twister in the deck, we have Echo of Eons in the deck, you will very possibly be able to just continue chaining together extra turns. Maybe not infinite turns, because that would just require the God Hand, just drawing non-stop heat. But it's certainly not impossible, especially to go back to what we talked about with, like, Dragon's Rage Channeler out, helping you filter. Ashling helping you filter. Artist Talent helping you filter. Like, you'll be able to just discard those lands to get rid of the things you don't need. So, like, Izzet Gauntlet does actually present a very real threat to the table in and of itself with your commander. But it has the added bonus of being really good with these win conditions in this deck. With that out of the way, so we talked about Bergie. The other side's very good. It's able to help you filter through your deck to find, a crucial piece that you might need. If you don't think that you'll be able to do enough with your hand as it currently is, even with that extra mana generation, it's a great option to flip over and, to play Harnfell, Horn of Bounty. I would personally only really recommend doing it if you have 5 or more cards, not including Bergie in your hand, or Harnfell, whatever the fuck. Another notable part about this is Displacer Kitten, incidentally, has some synergy here, where you could just flicker Harnfell. These double-sided cards have very weird interactions. Flickering Urabrask when it's on its Saga side See what I mean by, playing a game of Operation, trying to avoid Stormkill and Artist. But yeah, flickering, the Saga side, after you've destroyed some problematic creatures, maybe your opponent has an Orcish Bowmasters out, and you just really need to get rid of it, so you flip your Urbrask, you can just flip it right back over with Displacer Kitten. Displacer Kitten puts in so much work in this deck. Yes, it can flicker your commander so that, after you've already ulted your commander, and let's say you're at, 1 or 2 loyalty, you can flicker it to get this reduction again. Or you could plus 1 your commander to get a minus, get your instants and sorceries to cost 1 less, and then you could flicker it, and now they cost 2 less, because that still stays in effect after your commander's flipped over. Furthermore, really just Pinnacle Monk is like the biggest thing that I keep in mind when I'm thinking about Displacer Kitten, because it's an odd infinite combo. It's not too odd to like the players that have played for a long time. Stuff like Deadeye Navigator, Archaeomancer was like a classic combo back in the day of like 2019. So it pays homage to its predecessors in that way. But in this deck, if our main game plan isn't going too well, the Bone Throne, of course, as it's been referred to, the Meat Seat, or Aria of Flame these get exiled. It's a nice thing to know that you do have a backup option. But if you're finding that you are consistently accidentally, exiling all your backup win cons, Displacer Kitten, Pinnacle Monk, or maybe you've been needing to play Pinnacle Monk as a land because the deck is notably short on lands. Stuff like, Urbrask gets exiled. I think a good option that we could slot into this deck pretty painlessly is Radstorm. It has... So, I gotta throw in a caveat with... I think most of the time, the use cases for this spell in this deck are deceptively narrow. Because although it's nice to be able to proliferate your commander, oftentimes, if I have enough mana to cast Radstorm, and my commander's on the front side, there are so few use cases in which I'm going to cast Radstorm, flip my commander, proliferate, or, cast another spell, flip my commander, then cast Radstorm, now that there's no cost reduction, because the cost reduction is only when it's on its front side. Theoretically, of course you could, +1 your commander. I think it was... Nope, there we go. Theoretically, you could +1 your commander, and then, Radstorm. That just doesn't feel great. I do like the idea, Displacer Kitten, flickering your commander back over after doing a +1. And that now your Radstorm costs 2 less, which is way more doable in this deck. But if you're in a situation where you have 4 mana open and your commander is flipped and you are not threatening the game, that's not a great spot to be in, because Planeswalkers notoriously are, it's the classic dies to removal. These are one of the easiest permanents to remove, if not the easiest permanent to remove on the battlefield. Any person with a semi-sentient creature, some semblance of a brainstem, they just swing their 1/1 token. God help you if they have a Sarah Ascendant or anything that wants to attack. Because notably, we just don't have a lot of creatures. We don't have a lot of ways to block for your commander if they're flipped onto the Planeswalker's side. I cannot speak English. I appreciate you bearing with me. So that's something to keep in mind, that we don't really want to just flip over our commander whenever we have the opportunity, as I'm sure you know. But more important is, as we've talked about, flipping it over on that 6th spell cast so that you can ult it immediately. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You know, as we've touched on, as I was just saying, the I think Radstorm is a decent include if you're finding that your main win conditions are getting exiled because, you know, it's like DJ Khaled suffering from success. Your commander's doing what it's doing, you're cooking up a storm, you got a barbecue going in the backyard, you're having a great time. You exile all of your win conditions. You are up Schitt's Creek without a paddle. The location, Schitt's Creek. It's like an actual place, I'm pretty sure. That out of the way. Radstorm is really good in this deck with Prologue to Phyresis. Yes. No one likes to win with poison counters in a casual game. This deck admittedly kind of blurs the line between casual and, like, you know, maybe a lower power CEDH deck, because this deck's certainly not doing all of the things that a CEDH RAL deck would be doing. It does take some funny, like, you know, dips and turns, and it plays some cards that are perhaps not the most ideal cards to slot in, but they're fun. You know, they're fun to play. They're fun to play against. Losing to an Aria of Flame, having someone to deal 30 damage to you off of casting like a Faithless Looting is pretty memorable. It's great. And personally, I can't speak for other people. I would much rather lose to like an Aria of Flame or you flickering, you know, Displacer Kitten, Pinnacle Monk, and lightning bolting me. Where's this lightning bolt? Oh my gosh. Is this not an up-to-date? Oh my goodness. Okay, and we're back. Sorry about that. Took a minute for Moxfield to load. So yes, I for one believe flickering Pinnacle Monk and a ritual with Displacer Kitten to kill the table with lightning bolt being chained. Oh, this art's so ugly. What is going on with this art? Anything else? There we go. No, you know, hate to the artist. I mean, sorry, it took me a second to just take in the Secret Lair art. This deck has a lot of ways to win that are, I think, inherently not going to produce salt at the table. But it's hard to say if a Radstorm for 9 would make people upset. I think as long as it's not your primary way of winning, that people wouldn't really mind it. One of the reasons Radstorm's good in the deck is because even if it gets exiled by your commander, you can still cast it. And you also, notably, you don't have to cast those spells immediately. Like, you can cast them this turn, but that doesn't mean you have to cast them, like, you know, the second you have the chance. If you exile a Windfall, if you exile an Echo Vions, a Gamble, Inspired Tinkering, any of these effects, you can just chill and let your storm count build, and then have the maybe Mystical Tutor for like a Prologue to Phyresis, and then have that Radstorm go off and end the game. Because, you know, it's worth throwing out there that one of the appeals to Radstorm as an alternative win con is Izzet decks in particular struggle at closing out games. And I'm sure you, like myself, have been at a table, held hostage, strapped in the chair as someone's taking their 40th action with no end in sight in their Izzet deck. I've been that person frequently, sorry. Having an option to just kind of shut the lights out, you know, pull the plug, the game's over. It's nice. I can't even, you know, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's a nice option. So talking about other cards that are on the sideboard, I think a hot take here is one of the last cuts I made to this deck was the One Ring being on the sideboard, not being in the 99. And I know, put the pitchforks down. Everyone, it's okay. I have reasoning. So, Displacer Kitten synergizes well. You know, you don't have to fear dying from its upkeep trigger. We do have the Ichor Moon Gauntlet, which could give you more card draw if you need it. But the thing is, in my playtest with this deck, the amount of times that I've cast the One Ring is the amount of times that I've met the President. And that's 0. I've not ever cast this card. Not whether it's because it's exiled, whether it's because it's 4 mana. It just felt like, when I was being honest with myself, this card was originally in the 99 because it's just a good card. But is it a good card in this deck for what we are trying to do? I think there's a good case to be made that there are better options. Let me double check what I replaced it with. Oh yeah, so originally I had cut Urabrask because it's a creature. We are very intentional about the creatures that are in this deck. But when I thought about it, would I rather have an Urabrask in my hand or the One Ring? I have plenty of cards that draw me additional cards in this deck. And the One Ring's protection is nice, but Urabrask, there's only really one other card in this deck that does what it does, and that's Burgi, which is debatably the best creature in this deck. So when I came to accept that, I mean the choice was obvious. And also just the chance that you could have Ichormoon Gauntlet out and you could just churn through. Where is this? Okay. And you could just keep going through this saga, creating treasures, dealing 3 damage, getting a pseudo underworld breach effect, and then, it flips back over. And then, oh, what do you know? You can flip it again for 1 mana. And then you could just keep going through the same thing. The fact it feeds into itself. It creates 3 mana. It gives you red mana every time you cast a spell. And then it allows you to cast your stuff from your graveyard. I mean, it does everything we would want a card to do in this deck. Whereas the One Ring is, the turn you play it, it is drawing you a card. And although this deck certainly wants to draw cards, I would rather take, personally, looting 7 times. That's not fair. We'll say looting 4 times. Casting 4 different spells at reduced cost that let you loot, then a one-off effect that is powerful, but a bit limited. With that out of the way, I know I'm speaking blasphemy at this point. I think a good thing for us to touch on are cards that you could consider replacing if this deck is feeling a little wonky. I think Snap, although it is mana positive, although it's a objectively good card with this commander, I think there's a good argument that it doesn't really do what we want a card in this deck to do, typically. Really, we want to just fill this deck with looting effects, with mana generation, and then we want to just go off to the races. We want to find a cheap mana rock, and then we want to just churn out as much value as we can. That doesn't mean that's how you have to play it every time. But for instance, I mean, of course Snap is good, but something like Geistwave with our commander out costs 1 mana. You can also use it to return your mana vault to hand. And now it has net 3 mana. Well, it's net 2 mana, because your commander's out. Granted, they're generic, but it's also drawn you a card, and it's increased your, storm count for your commander. Whereas Snap, it's good to have some form of removal. I think that this is perhaps not necessary. If you're looking for replacements for it, it'll really depend on how the deck's feeling for you. If you feel like you're running into scenarios where you have enough mana that you could cast Time Spiral for 5 mana, I mean, Time Spiral untaps 6 lands. So, I talked about how expensive the One Ring is, and it is, but for 1 more mana, you could untap up to 6 lands, and in this deck, you will untap all your lands. And then you also are getting a fresh 7 cards. You're basically taking an extra turn and drawing 7 cards with this card. So that's something to consider. If you are finding that you have enough rituals, that you have enough card draw, or rather, enough looting effects, maybe Time Spiral is a good option. Maybe Radstorm's a good option. We were just talking about why we would include Radstorm. I think there's a very real chance that Radstorm could replace Snap. Glimpse the Impossible also generates you colorless mana. The only downside is it's going to generate it for you for your next turn. So that's where my caveat comes in. Other than that, there's tons of cards, in the considering in the sideboard, some of which there's a little bit of overlap. And I'm happy to help you with picking a replacement if there are cards you are feeling are dead. Very possible. It's very possible that as you're playing it, there are going to be issues that I couldn't foresee when I was building this deck. Another thought that comes to mind is, as good as Seagate Restoration is, listen, I'm not a professor, I'm not a genius, I'm not a scientist, none of these things. But 7 mana is a lot of fucking mana. 3 blue pips in this 7 mana. You could tell me nothing else about this spell, and I would tell you you're fucking crazy if you think I'm ever casting this in this deck. 7 mana, 3 blue pips. You could just tell me that it has 3 blue pips, and it's like I would not be convinced. Really, the main reason it's in this deck is because, it's a land on the other side, and there is a chance that you can cast it, but also exiling this with your commander, it's gas. It's gas when you exile it with your commander. Ideally, even, exiling something like a Seagate Restoration, if what you need in the moment is card draw, Mystical Tutoring as your 6th spell for turn, flipping your commander, and then alting to get a Seagate Restoration, it's great. It's a great option to have. It's probably not going to be the best option most of the time. I would make an argument that pretty much every time you could Mystical Tutor, that Mana Geyser is going to be the best card in your deck. If you are in that exact scenario where Mystical Tutor is your 6th instant or sorcery spell, going for Mana Geyser and attempting to flip Ral, it may not immediately win you the game, but it will give you the means to cast any spells that you are given after those 8 exiled spells resolve. Because chances are you have so many card draw options in this deck that it's not just that you're exiling 8 spells. The odds of you exiling a card that draws you something is extremely high. And the worst spot you could be in after you've gone off, you've killed your commander, now what? I've drawn cards, I can't cast them. But if you get Mana Geyser, not only, yes, can you cast spells that you've drawn into, you can also cast your commander again. So you could just immediately cast Mana Geyser, cast your commander again, and then cast one of the free spells you got, and just keep doing that till you flip him again. And then just ult him again. The top 16 of your deck, all instants and sorceries of which are free, is insane strength. There are very, very few cards that would give you that deep of a dig into your deck and then grant them the free status. It's like tax evasion, but legal. Another notable card in the deck, maybe this is just biased from my experience playing an Izzet deck, but Gale, Waterdeep Prodigy, kind of slaps. And it's part of the reason for this specific distribution of spells, 23 instants, 22 sorceries, being in that spot where you can cast a Born Upon a Wind for 1 mana with your Gale out. And then as a result, it's worth mentioning, this causes your spells to ignore timing restrictions. Because it's like upon the cast, you are now able to cast, the opposite type. If you cast an instant spell, on the cast, you're able to cast a sorcery spell from your graveyard. So it now is you can cast your sorcery in your graveyard at instant speed. And so it's just rewarding you for all the looting you've done up to that point. Casting a Born Upon a Wind to just draw a card to give your spells flash, and then you cast, I don't know, let's say Faithless Looting, draw 2, discard 2. This resolves. Now, any sorcery in your hand is going to allow you to cast Born Upon a Wind again from your graveyard. Or, for a more extreme example, you could cast Intellectual Offering. Cast your Jeska's Will now from your graveyard. Okay. Sweet. Wonderful. Perfect. Excellent. Yes, I will take 7 red mana and exile the top 3 cards of my library. But the flash component also is just really nice. If you are in a situation where you have Gale out, suddenly, and you have Born Upon a Wind, suddenly just every card in your graveyard is, it's a buffet. It's so many options, because chances are by the time you're able to get Gale out, you have already cast a good amount of instants and sorcery spells. This is not really a creature you want out in the early game. But, I think I'm also biased because in the decks I've played Gale in, he is absolutely slapped. I have reason to believe he would be very good in this deck because you are looting so much. But there's a chance that, you just find you're never really playing him. And it's okay to cut him. Just because something has worked for me in the past doesn't mean that it has to be what you go with today. And if you are looking to cut him, what you replace him with is always kind of the hard question. I think objectively, it's a good idea to consider replacing him with an instant or sorcery spell, just because of the synergy it has with your deck. Something like Flick a Coin being effectively 1 mana, deal a damage, draw a card, because the treasure, presumably, going towards the cost of this, is a great option. But of course, we'll burn that bridge when we get to it, as they say. Simian Spirit Guide. This is a card that the first time you use this in a game, your opponents, and I know your opponents, because they're my opponents, they're my friends, they're your friends, will have an audible gasp of a, I didn't know we were playing these decks. Yes. Welcome to the Bone Throne. This card, if you're not careful, will immediately make you, in our group, the archenemy. Because there are few casual decks that are running Simian Spirit Guide to try to accelerate their game plan. It's also, one of the reasons I put it in the deck is that, yes, it's great for mana generation, but in the off chance that for whatever reason you don't need mana generation, it feels pretty good to have some cards that you can just discard. Not being that worried about it. But let's be honest, most of the time just drawing into a Simian Spirit Guide, when you just cast your last instant or sorcery spell in your hand, you drew into a Simian Spirit Guide, you drew into a Faithless Looting, but fuck, I have no mana. Simian Spirit Guide is so clutch in those moments. It's also really nice on turn 1 if you just have a land and then Simian Spirit Guide in hand, and then a 2-cost, red spell, or, 2-cost blue spell, and you have a dual land out. Getting your commander out in that situation and having spells you can cast the next turn feels surprisingly good. And from my playtests, it may not always lead you to a winning position, but more often than you'd think, it'll allow you to draw enough cards that if you don't hit a landable, it's like, okay, well, fuck, I just wasn't gonna draw a land this game. Okay, well, now that we've been chatting it up for a minute, I think we've covered most of the things I wanted to talk about. Talked about Seagate Restoration, talked about the Bone Throne. What makes this card so good, as I know you know, is that these charge counters don't go away. As we've talked about, proliferating them is excellent, but even just playing the game, you want to play it with your commander out. This card just quickly becomes the, most threatening thing at the table. The first few spells you cast, people forget that it isn't that you're casting 1 spell, dealing 1 damage, casting 2 spells, now you've dealt 2 damage. No. It's, I've cast 1 spell, ping you for 1, cast 2nd spell, now you've been pinged for 3, cast 3rd spell, you're now pinged for 6. If you're just hitting the same person. Cast your 4th spell, you're now pinged for 10. And really the big reason I think people don't play it is because it's 7 mana. Very reasonable, decision not to play a 7 mana, artifact in an instant and sorcery spell deck. But you just gotta go with the high play sometimes. There are so many rituals in this deck, there are cheap mana rocks. I don't think it's unreasonable to believe that you will either be able to tutor up an effect, like a Seething Song that costs you 2 mana, and you happen to have, 3 available open mana afterwards, super doable in my head. Or like, you have a Mana Geyser. Getting this Sphinx-bone wand out right before you ult your commander, whew! Like, people are in for pain. Okay, we've talked about Urbrask, we've talked about the great work. Sorry, I'm just making sure we covered all of our points. Archmage Emeritus, he's a friend, but unfortunately, just didn't make the cut this time. Flux Channeler, I barely know her. Okay, yes, Urbrask again. Hello, nice to see you. Yeah, that looks like we've covered pretty much everything. I think a lot of people get deterred from Aria of Flame because they read that first line of text, each opponent gains 10 life, and they're like, ooh, scary. How am I going to kill them now that they have 50 life? As I'm sure you know from playtesting this deck, the difference between your opponent dying when they were at 40 and dying when they were at 50 is like a single spell when this card gets rolling. In my playtest, I have gotten this to 13 counters consistently. And having it where my Faithless Looting is dealing 13, and then I cast a Ponder to deal another 14 damage, 27 damage, is insane. The idea that there's, it is an overwhelming threat. It is something that, once it gets rolling, and with this deck, the whole point of this deck is to make sure this type of effect gets rolling. And once it does, it is nigh unstoppable. Okay, I think we've covered pretty much everything I was hoping to cover with this video. As I've touched on in the guide that I sent you, I just wanted to make sure I reiterate that if you want to make any changes to it, if it's not playing the way you'd like it to play, I offer free adjustments to these decks on the house. And of course, I don't know how long I could do that for. If I'm getting a ton of commissions, maybe it'll have to be a little bit more limited than that. But for now and for the foreseeable future, it's just my way of saying thank you. Thank you for choosing me for this commission. Thank you for inviting me in for this process and being a part of this with me. And I just love the collaboration side of things when it comes to Magic. And I hope that this deck brings you some great experiences. And anything less than that, I'm more than happy to help. Thank you again. And I hope you have a wonderful night.